So good evening, everyone, and thank you for making time to come here at this time of the day during the week. And we are very pleased to start the first in a series of panel discussions looking at attacks on healthcare in conflict zones here at QMUL University. And I just, first of all, need to do the housekeeping. So there's toilets right in front of you here or slightly around. You go around the staircase and they're over there. The emergency exits are the one you came through, the main one. An assembly point is outside. There's also an emergency fire exit. After you, if you follow around the floor, essentially where the toilets are, there's another exit over there. So attacks on clearly marked ambulances targeting healthcare workers, the bombing of hospitals and restriction on medical supplies, denial of access to healthcare are all a part of a continuum of violence that is seen in conflicts from Gaza through to Ukraine, Sudan and beyond. This continuum of violence represents a shift in the norms of war and undermining of humanitarian law and principles with severe consequences for those delivering healthcare in conflict zones and the population reliant on their care. We're starting this series of events with a panel discussion which will focus mostly on Gaza and maybe Lebanon possibly. And one of our colleagues will soon explain why we've started with this case first and foremost. In this panel, our speakers will reflect on their own experience of delivering healthcare in conflict zones, and they will situate their experience in this wider context of the state of humanitarian medicine and attacks on healthcare and healthcare workers. So this event is being organized by a whole group of us, the Global Public Health Unit, which I work in together with and co-lead with my colleague here, Fiona Samuels, the Center for Climate and Crime and Climate Justice, the Center for Law and Society in a Global Context, the Center for the Study of Race, Class and Empire, the Center on Labor Sustainability and Global Production, the International State Crime Initiative, the Queen Mary University of London Palestine in Focus, and the South Asia Forum. But we're also very excited to have co-organized this event with a whole host of colleagues from Barts NHS Trust. And that was particularly important to us to work quite closely with our clinical colleagues, given that this is a topic that affects your profession very closely. In the same vein, our speakers tonight are Ms. Swee Chai Ang, who is an orthopaedic consultant surgeon, and Dr. James Smith, who's a lecturer in humanitarian policy and practice and also an emergency physician, and Professor Neve from the School of Law will introduce them and their work more in detail in a second. And with that, I just want to say we have a Teams parallel session going on. Hopefully the technology will hold. So if you see things flashing, that might be coming from there. And I don't think there was anything else. Yes, and then maybe towards the end, we will have a little wrap-up time in which we can also share some up-to-date information about other events that you might be interested in that are related to this topic and this cause. Thank you. So I'm just going to let Dr. Mohammed Kanji give us a sort of quick overview as to why we're starting with Gaza. You do that yourself?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to start by showing you this graph, and this represents healthcare workers that have been killed in conflict zones by territory. And just to put things in context, there's been a recent and unprecedented increase in the attacks on healthcare. This graph shows the cumulative number of healthcare workers that have been killed covering the last 20 months. Data are collected from reputable organizations, so publicly available sources through the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, and from non-profit organizations such as Insecurity Insight, which is based in the UK. I've got to reveal the key here. So as you'll see, the highest number of deaths, so that's the green and the red line, are in Gaza, followed by the blue, which is Lebanon. And then you've got, in kind of order going down, is Ukraine. You've got Myanmar, Sudan, and Israel. So just bear that in mind. So in Gaza, there have been about 1,600 healthcare workers killed. This graph is up till May of 2025. So there have been further deaths since then, and about 600 healthcare workers within Lebanon. One of the things I wanted to maybe acknowledge was that this data has been collated and the graph has been curated by one of my trainees, a very talented person, and I wanted to acknowledge him personally, but actually he asked me to not mention him for fear that it may affect his future career. And just to kind of put things in context, so I'm a cardiologist, and I wanted to share a case example that's recent, so from the 2nd of July. So on the 2nd of July, there was an Israeli strike on an apartment building where Dr. Marwan al-Sultan, a renowned and experienced cardiologist, was living, and his apartment block there was a strike that happened there. He was the medical director of the Indonesian hospital, and he was killed in that strike, along with his wife and his 5 children. About a month before he was killed, the Indonesian hospital for which he was the medical director was left non-functional because of direct attacks there. And Dr. Marwan was one of only 2 cardiologists that were left in the Gaza Strip. So every single one of these deaths that you see on the graph is a personal tragedy, but it's also linked with wider consequences on health due to our diminished ability to provide care for our patients that results in increased mortality and morbidity at a population level. One of the things we wanted to do is take this opportunity is to acknowledge the sacrifices that our colleagues have made, both those who have been killed, but those who continue to risk their lives to help others by observing a minute's silence. And in that minute, one of the things I would like all of us to try and do is to consider what we can do to try and protect ourselves as healthcare workers, our colleagues, and our patients from such attacks, regardless of where they are. Now I'd like to introduce our first main speaker. So I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Neve Gordon. Professor Gordon's research focuses on international humanitarian law, human rights, the ethics of violence, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and attacks on healthcare in global conflict zones. After teaching for 17 years at Ben Gurion University in Israel, Neve Gordon joined the School of Law at Queen Mary University of London. He is the author of a number of books. So he's authored a book called Israel's Occupation and co-authored other books, including The Human Right to Dominate and Human Shields, A History of People in the Line of Fire. Professor Gordon is the former chair of the British Society of Middle East Studies, Committee on Academic Freedom. He is a fellow at the British Academy of Social Sciences and writes regularly for the Popular Press. Professor Gordon.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. I'd like to begin by thanking those who organized this event, particularly Sarah Farini, Andreas Michael, William Ricketts, Mohsen Badat, Mohammed Kananji, Lisa Chaudhary, and Fidax. As Mohammed said, my name is Neve, and in the past decade or so, I have this. Can you hear me? In the past decade or so, I've been working on the relationship between international humanitarian law, the law that is supposed to protect healthcare workers in times of war, and I've been working on it in the context of attacks on healthcare in different theaters of political violence. So before introducing our 2 speakers tonight, I'd like to say briefly 2 short things about my work and the event this evening. First of all, when I go and speak, a lot of people put a lot of hope in the law in changing these horrendous situations that we're witnessing, whether it's the genocide in Gaza or whether it's the attacks on healthcare in Sudan or Myanmar and other places around the world. And in my work, what I've been trying to show is that the law itself is actually part of the problem and not part of the solution. And I'm not going to discuss that here, but I will only say that the law, after it says that attacking medical units and healthcare personnel and transport is prohibited and warring parties should never do it, it provides a series of exceptions that allow the warring parties to attack. And these exceptions are used by the warring parties, and they use them to legitimize and justify the attacks, and the law actually allows them to do that. And I can discuss that a bit more in the Q&A if people are interested after our two speakers speak. But I will only say that my position in this regard, and I think it's a position that healthcare workers will find easy to accept, is that the only way to protect medical systems and healthcare workers, and of course the wounded and sick, is by introducing a complete non-derogable prohibition on attacking healthcare, a ban not unlike the ban of using landmines, of using chemical warfare, and of torture. The second point I'd like to say tonight is that last night on Channel 4, I watched Gaza Doctors and Under Attack after BBC had banned it. To all those who have not watched this film, I really recommend dedicating the hour to watch it. It is, and I'm not saying it lightly, it's a must-see. But what perplexed me as I was watching the wrenching scene after wrenching scenes of hospitals being attacked, of patients dying, of the machinery collapsing, of the electricity being out, and the heroic acts of the doctors and the nurses and the medics that were working against all odds, what caught me was this ban. I thought about the moral principles that inform our lives today, about the officials at the BBC who watched this film and decided to ban it, and about the actual attacks on healthcare and the widespread that we see in this movie, and the widespread resistance among governments and the legal communities to ban these attacks. We have reached a stage where the evidence-based knowledge on attacks on healthcare is banned for the sake, one might argue, that attacks on healthcare will continue. We urgently need to reverse the order of bans, allowing the knowledge to circulate unobstructed while banning attacks on healthcare. We hope this series will contribute, if only a little, to this process. It is therefore that with great enthusiasm, I'd like to introduce our two speakers tonight, whose work I admire, and I feel a great privilege to be here as their moderator. Our first speaker will be, they taught me that I should call her Ms. because of some old antiquated English thing, but I'll call her Dr. Swee Chai Ang. Swee obtained her medical degree in the early 1970s at the University of Singapore and later trained as an orthopaedic surgeon in Newcastle. She was the first female orthopedic consultant appointed by St. Bartholomew and the Royal London Hospitals. In the 80s and early 90s, she took time out to work as trauma and orthopedics consultant in the refugee camps in Lebanon and later for the United Nations in Gaza and the World Health Organization in the West Bank. She is the co-founder and patron of Medical Aid for Palestine, which many people, if not all, here in this room know and are aware of how important this charity has been, not only in the past 22 months, but for decades. Dr. Ang is co-author of War Surgery and also of Acute Care of the War Wounded. In addition to other orthopedic publications, she wrote From Beirut to Jerusalem, documenting her experience in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and Gaza. It is such an honor to have you here today with us, Dr. Swee. But before she begins, I will just introduce our second speaker so they can follow right up after the other. Our second speaker is Dr. James Smith. James is an emergency physician based in London, currently working as a lecturer in humanitarian policy and practice at UCL. He brings with him years of work experience spanning humanitarian public health, advocacy, and humanitarian affairs. James has authored many articles, and I will only mention a few topics just to give you a sense of what he has been working and thinking about in the past few years. So among his articles are pediatric medical evacuations from Gaza, bridging AI and humanitarianism, safeguarding healthcare workers in Gaza and throughout the occupied Palestine, and humanitarian responsibilities in the context of structural injustice. Each speaker will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will open it up to Q&A, both from our online audience and from the in-person audience. If you're online, then please write your questions, and the moderators will send them to my WhatsApp. So if you see me looking at my phone, it's because I'm looking at their questions. Regarding house rules, we will accept questions only after the speakers deliver their presentations. Please formulate your question in a concise way and end it with a question mark. Please, while all questions are welcome, we will not accept racist or sexist remarks or different religious phobias. And so, without further ado, Swee, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for coming here. And for those online, thank you very much. I am sorry I did not invite a lot more people because I wasn't clear as to who are entitled to come here and who are entitled not. For instance, we did not invite the house workers, okay? And I feel very guilty because I really want them to see my slides. I spoke in most of their rallies and demonstrations, but they never seen the slides. But anyway, okay. It's Bart's house before the PFI changed. And of course, you will know that 2 days ago is the 77th 20th anniversary. And as I was sitting in St. Paul's at the commemoration, I kept with every word that's spoken about God and healing and care and human beings. I cannot switch off because there's such a world of difference between the victims of 7/7 and the victims of Gaza. Because we purportedly treated the victims very well. We had 190 over of, in fact, I would say a third of all the victims brought to our hospital. We lost only 2 of them. We operate on all of them. We have 12 theatres, we have full complement of staff, we got everything, everything, everything. But more important than anything, our patients have a home to go back to. They got rehabilitation. It's painful. It's painful to be wounded. It's painful to have a life change. But at least there's a way forward. People in Gaza and in Lebanon don't have anything like that. They are lucky if they receive a Panadol, or they can lose their legs and not die. They don't have a home to go to. We go back to the tent, and all the tents were bombed and burnt. No future. So that is the difference, okay? As for health givers, we operate in safety and security with everything we need in the Royal London. We did not run out of blood. We did not run out of medications. Our teams are functioning, which is totally different from what's happening in Gaza or London. I cooked in both of them. And there's no end point. Even right now, we don't know what will happen in Gaza. Will there be ceasefire? Will there be ceasefire in 6 weeks? Will it break down again? I have no idea. So, when your doctors and your treating team works in a state of anxiety, it is different from them working in a state of security. When I was operating on the 7-7 patients, I know nobody will come in and bomb the hospital or take me prisoner or torture me. But in Gaza, my medical colleagues and surgical colleagues, they operate knowing that at any time their homes can be totally destroyed. We know that. We all know that. But now I'm going to trace what happened through my own personal experience, because I'm not an academic. I do things right, I do things wrong. I speak up and get into trouble, and maybe get you into trouble too. This is Gaza. People living in tents. This is Gaza on the 21st of June, in a safe zone. We cannot be happy in isolation. We cannot, as health provider, work in a bubble. The bubble has burst. We have to move beyond. We can only be free if others are free. You know what happened since October 2023. These are figures in February, running up just to the ceasefire, just a few days after the ceasefire. Okay? This was astounding. So when you do this, you see, correct, you always have to put a date and put a source, okay? Next slide, same, but notes, hostages, homeless, 35,000 children, often, either with no parents or one parent. So, as a doctor, how do you feel? As a human being, how do you feel? So the status report. That time is July, so it's not so drastic. Buried under rubble. Lancet in July thought that probably 166,000 would die. But that was July, right? Their counting was in July. Now it's July 2025, so God knows. 13th of November, look at medical personnel killed, 1,047. Now, Dr. Monat Kanji just told us 1,500. 8 workers died, end users harmed, journalists killed. 35 out of the 6 hospitals destroyed. 21 completed out of action. This is the website you go through. It's called Ultra. Just Google Ultra, flash, okay, and then you take your week by week figures. So 64,000 deaths, 123,000 injured, health workers killed, homeless, agricultural land destroyed, so that people cannot come back to live. And 81% of Gaza close to Palestinian exile. Starvation, diseases, fuel, vaccination, and not to forget what is banned. Some of you have visited the bills back, okay? Then came the ceasefire. If you were like me, after staying 1 year, or maybe a bit more than a year, suffering, wondering, crying, being unable to help, wondering why nobody cares about Gaza, the news of the ceasefire was amazing. And I watched again and again the more than 500,000 Palestinians displaced to the southern half of Gaza, walking with little belongings back north, like the Exodus, but this time they're returning home. And I keep magnifying the pictures more and more to look at their faces, because I might ask myself, at least thinking, are they full of hope? Are they full of foreboding? How would one react to a tragedy like this? But yet they walked home to northern Gaza, home to this kind of ruin and rubble, to pitch their tent, to stake their claim in the ruin and rubble, that we are Palestinians, Gaza belongs to us, and we belong to Gaza. This is kindness. I took this picture when I was in Kaslet, and it's the second largest city in Gaza, very crowded. And you can imagine if anyone put a 2,000 bomb into any of the building to take out a Hamas leader, what will happen to the neighbors? So that's what happened to Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis have been attacked again and again. So every time the tents withdrew, people go home to see what's remained of their home, to identify the bodies of their loved ones. Okay? So this is the latest update, June 2025. So the most up-to-date figures. Okay? So ever since the ceasefire, there are 6,500 people killed just from 15th of March. 22,500 injured, and 714 young Palestinians re-displaced, probably fleeing the north and fleeing the safe zone, and the situation of massive escalation of bombardment on land and the sea. And of course, I mustn't forget the GHF. And then, right at the borders, 9,000 trucks, including the several hundred trucks that MEC has bought for food, medicine, baby powder, medical equipment to go into Gaza, blockaded. Children die. And then, collected food. Look at this. And they get 5 hours and kids. Now, this is also dated, the ICJ, 29th of December. Plausible genocide. That time, we use the word plausible so that it softens the shock of the word genocide. Now, the rulings are dated. It is a genocide before our own eyes. And then the delegitimization and the defunding of United Nations UNRWA, Work and Relief Agency. I was an UNRWA refugee. I tell you a bit about UNRWA because you won't hear anywhere else. That was a branch of the UN commissioned by the General Assembly in 1949 when the world realized that the Palestinian refugees, the 750,000 who were displaced, now living in very nasty conditions all over the Middle East, are going to die. So the General Assembly voted to set up the United Nations Work and Relief Agency to look after this lot of refugees. They have been with the Palestinian refugees ever since that year. There are 58 Palestinian refugees scattered all over the Middle East. So the Palestinian refugees did not begin in October 2003. Someone mentioned very kindly that authentic to do with Lebanon, I do it. Every year in September, I will buy a plane ticket and go back to Lebanon to be with the families of the victims, to lay flowers at the mass grave, and to assure them that at least some of us will never forget them, even if the world will. Last year, as I was setting off and coming off the plane, a whole lot of people came to greet me and said, don't go for commemoration. Go to the hospital. We got a pager attack. And of course, we had the pager attack. 4,000 people were wounded when the pagers exploded in their hand. We are talking to medical people, so this is not too gruesome. Just think, it's not only the hand, but it's also the eyes. Many of them are blind, and the airways and scalp. We struggled for days and days, and when we thought we finished the primary Deborah bomb and made plans for the reconstruction, Lebanon was bombed. Heavy bombs, 2,000 pounds, 1,000 pounds. And people from the south began flee. And over the few months, maimed, blind, homeless, injured, and killed. All on one page. People are not numbers. But when I'm telling the story from the Middle East, I just have to do. So, it didn't begin in October 2023. These maps are historical and contemporary. You can see the map on the left. Many of you have seen it. That was historic Palestine under the British mandate. The green was the indigenous people, Jews, Muslims, and Christians living there, and with some migrant from Europe. The next one is a UN partition deciding to give 56% of historic Palestine to form a Jewish homeland, and the rest for the people of the land. So, at one stroke, that's it. Then, in 1948, the Nakba happened, the tragedy of the Palestinian people, and that is even worse because they lost more land. The Palestinians, which are green, are forced into refugee camps in Gaza and also in the West Bank. And finally, on the right is the Oslo Accord, the two-state solution. Under this proposal, you have about 12% of the original Palestine to form the new Palestinian state. But that is not the end. They are all under blockade. They are cantonized. And that's it. I don't have to say anymore. It's not complicated. No wonder some of us are very upset, very angry at the injustice, very angry that we're not allowed to tell our story. We have to tell our story in such a way that's not offensive, so that people cannot blame me of touting hate speech. Say it as a fact. Say it with maps. So in 1982, here was I. I was a Zionist, an extremely Zionist Christian, supported Israel all my life. And then I saw Israeli planes bombing another country, and I just couldn't believe it. Perhaps some of my younger colleagues feel the same way when they see what's happening in the Middle East now. I just couldn't take it. So finally, I resigned from my job and took a plane to Lebanon and verified for myself that the destruction is real and it's true. 11-floor buildings sucked in, bearing 200 people. Don't need a doctor anymore. And that is just to get a group called the PLO out. Of course, at the time of the whole medical team sent by Christian Aid, I'm probably the only one who was very happy that PLO was gone. I thought with that would come peace. I believed totally in Pax Americana. I believe in the Harvey peace plan that once the PLO evacuated, Lebanon will be left in peace, the refugees can rebuild their homes, and at least live as refugees in peace. And I was seconded to join the Palestine Red Crescent Society. When I came back from the first mission, half a month, the Israelis accused me of being a PLO member. I didn't know, because the Palestine Red Crescent Society is part of the PLO. It's the health ministry of the Palestinian people. You see, the Palestinian people have their health ministry, and I work for them. And they took me to Gaza hospital. At the time, Gaza meant nothing to me at all. It's just another word although I said. The Palestine Red Crescent Society had 9 hospitals, 8 of which was completely flattened, with the exception of Gaza hospital. It's 12 floor high. And here, I was in Gaza hospital. We were protected by the ICRC, I thought, okay? The top floors were blown up. The 6th floor, where the doctors live, was shelled. And it overlooked this. And I just thought, wow, it's very bombed, bad scenes away. And it took me 8 days to realize that this was a Palestinian refugee camp. The camp of Sabra and Shatila. These people have lived there for 34 years after losing their homes. They live in tents, and the tents gave way to containers, the brick buildings, and more buildings, and they became towns, the towns of Sabra and the towns of Shatila. And that was where the deja vu was, because on the 9th floor of Gaza, I could watch people coming back in service taxi, in donkey carts, with wounded children, with their few belongings back to rebuild their broken homes. And I make friends with them, and found to my shock that they call themselves Palestinians. They were the Palestinian people that the world refused to acknowledge. I work with Palestinian doctors and nurses. They have no security. Their homes were destroyed. Their families were killed. They turn up to work every day and looked after other people, and they looked after me. And because they looked after me, I had the sense of security. Even at that stage, I didn't understand their own insecurity, their own fears, and their own anxieties. I learned about the Palestinian culture. This is a beautiful Palestinian embroidery that I strongly recommend to you. It's extremely beautiful. I will give the whole world to have a dress like that. And later on I did. Okay, I tell you the circumstances later. But this was only 3 weeks. I got to learn as much about the Palestinians as I could in 3 weeks, all the time wondering what went wrong with our upbringing. BBC, my dear old BBC, announced to the whole world that the PLO has left behind 2,000 terrorists violating the evacuation agreement. So tanks came in, hundreds of them from the south, surrounded Beirut, invaded Beirut, and a contingent shelled its way into our camp. And the shelling came closer and closer, and soon we're surrounded by a lot of tanks, and we can't escape. Remember, these friends of mine were just told to go back and rebuild their homes. So Sabra and Shatila was flooded with people, rebuilding their homes, patching up the holes, sweeping the floors, cleaning up, and inviting me to drink coffee in the ruin and rubble. I can remember the women putting towels on the floor so that this precious Zionist doctor can sit on the floor and drink Arabic coffee. But they were killed mercilessly because they're totally defenseless. Terrorism is the deliberate killing of unarmed people. The old man who taught me how to drink Arabic coffee, the children will never see another day, and many other people rebuilding their homes. I'll show you this picture because you won't know. Both of them are healthcare workers. The man lying down, a volunteer from Bangladesh, a very senior theatre technician, very skilled, very good, and standing next to him, Norwegian nurse. They shot him, but not her. She's blonde, she got blue eyes. They didn't shoot her. They tried to kill her. And this is a child standing and then shot down the 27 members of his family, and he fainted. It was brought to us, and we saved his life. I'll tell how all this ended. On the last day, armored vehicles and men in military uniform came to the bottom of Gaza hospital and ordered all foreigners out. All foreigners come and line up. And of course, by then, I think I've learned. I know they're coming in to kill my patients. And the dilemma is whether we stand there and be shot or go with them. Might also be shot. That Swedish nurse, that Swedish nurse offered herself up to be a human shield to stay with her patients. A medical student volunteered to stay with her. And because of them, the 30 patients in her intensive care were not killed. But as we walked out, it was clear, and I learned the word "nefsakum." And I realized the whole truth, and that my Palestinian friends never lied. On each dead body will be a refugee identity card saying where they come from. Jaffa, Haifa, Tukaran, Galilee, and so on and so forth. And the other half in Gaza. And that's why Gaza Hospital, you want to remember their family. Of course, it was extremely difficult because what am I going to do? The paint on the walls are still fresh. There's a mass grave, and that's where we go every year to commemorate. 1,000 bodies were thrown here. Bulldozers bulldoze over them, fresh salt and lime to dissolve the body. Orphans were everywhere. Children with no homes to go to. And I visited Munir's grandmother just to tell her that a grandson was alive. And this is what she told me. I've got nothing left to say. Our sparrows are still here, our carnations give flowers, and the children are nowhere to be found. Beirut, he took all I had. He took the last hope in life, and my hard eyes stared at the streets. Abu Juhab, my eldest son, is cruelly cut off his roots on the resort. Children, I ask the grave to protect you, to give way so that you can breathe. How I envy those of you that present when my loved ones died. Did you let them die thirsty, or were you merciful enough to give them drink? Life, what life is meant to us. Our hearts have died and tears have dried, for all the land and women both died. God Almighty, give us patience. And my children, may my love always be lantern to impart, and may God show me the holy way. I came out of Hajjai's home, completely distraught. I didn't want to live. What kind of world is this? Until a group of children, one of them my kitchen, ran up to me and called me out. And then they decide to pose for me. And as I click my camera, they put their hand into 3 signs. And they say, we are not afraid. Show it to the friend. We are the children of Sabra and Shatila. Even if they destroy this camp and kill us, you will have this picture to prove to your friends who we are. Behind them were their broken holes. In front of them were decaying bodies, which are cut out. The air was filled with the stench of decaying human flesh. But between death, life, and destruction were the Palestinian children. So if it ever reached rock bottom in the middle of this genocide, I hope this little picture will give you courage to carry on.
Thank you so
Swee told me she had 200 slides, and I was quite hoping she would continue. I'd much rather listen to her speak and for me not to have to speak for very long. I've got a few slides, but just while we're pulling them up, I wanted to reflect on a few things that came to my mind. Firstly, thank you for having me here. And I think the second thing I just want to say, because there's something sort of hanging heavily in the air, I was really struck by the very simple graph that was put up on screen that simply describes an objective truth. The number of healthcare workers that have been killed in different geographical contexts over the course of recent months and years, and that we should have colleagues that feel so fearful sharing such quantitative figures with us that they don't want their names associated with those kind of things really makes me very fearful with respect to, you know, where we are and what has become of us. Similarly with the Channel 4, now Channel 4 documentary that the BBC dragged its heels over for such a long time. I mean, there are people in that documentary that I remember, I know rather, thankfully they're still alive. Abu Hassan, an PRCS colleague who you see hugging a colleague and bursting into tears when they've just found out that one of their colleagues has been killed. I just find it so striking that this is the moment that we share. There's something else I want to show you, this is literally hot off the press. This is a full-page advertisement that MSF have paid for. It's in the newspaper today. This has been hard fought for internally. I know there are some MSF colleagues in the audience. And it says, "We are witnessing a genocide in Gaza, and the UK government is complicit." You can find the same wording on the MSF UK website. This is the reality of the moment that we're now trying to navigate together. So I'm going to share a few reflections. I'm going to try and take a step back, really, and talk a little bit more about attacks on healthcare in the very broadest sense. A lot of it might feel a bit more theoretical and certainly less grounded than Swee's reflections. But what I think is really important about having Swee open up this discussion is that it's very clear when we talk about patterns and trends and trying to determine whether or not the situation now is unprecedented. Everything that Swee has just shared, you know, there are echoes of that in the present, of course. Attacks on healthcare in the 1980s in southern Lebanon, attacks on healthcare now. Bias in the BBC in the 1980s, bias in the BBC in 2025, and so on and so forth. And I think it's really important that we hold all of that together. So, without further ado, this is from the latest Insecurity Insight and Safeguarding Health in Conflict report. I wanted to share this to give a sense of the geographical scale, the scope of the problem. There's been a huge investment over the course of the last almost 10 years now, certainly since 2016, for reasons I'll discuss in a moment. A real renewed interest in documenting and trying to understand the full scope and scale of attacks on healthcare internationally. In 2024, 3,600 attacks on healthcare documented internationally. There's a lot that's, I want to say interesting. Interesting is obviously the wrong word, but what's really, one of the things that's most notable here is that the vast majority of attacks are from state actors. There's often a misperception that non-state armed groups, as they're often called, don't have an appreciation or an understanding of international law, and therefore will break international law either intentionally or unintentionally. You see here that these are state actors predominantly that are committing such crimes. What is unprecedented, and there is a lot of discussion about, you know, is what we're seeing now in relation to attacks on healthcare, is this an unprecedented moment, or are we just getting much better at documenting and speaking about the reality of attacks on healthcare? But one thing that is unprecedented is the proportion of attacks that have been committed against the Palestinian people. 36 countries last year that documented or reported attacks on healthcare, 38% of those attacks were in Palestine. That is unprecedented. That was followed by Ukraine, Lebanon, Myanmar, and Sudan, along with several other countries. And of course, that's shifted and changed over the course of the period in question here. I know Ola's here, and Ola's done a lot of work on attacks on healthcare and health response in Syria. Of course, attacks on healthcare in Syria were a very significant component that drove the renewed engagement with attacks on healthcare at the level of the UN, this push for renewed commitments and so on. The other thing that's important to say here is that this is most certainly a significant undercount, and there are several reasons for that I won't get into just now. But if we look at the disaggregated data between the West Bank and Gaza, the West Bank have reported more attacks on healthcare than Gaza in 2024. That's obviously that's not a correct statistic. The West Bank is documenting because the situation is such that they're able to document and to report in a more comprehensive fashion. But certainly there have been more attacks on healthcare in Gaza that have simply gone underreported. A proportion of those attacks are, of course, healthcare workers that have been killed. Also healthcare workers that have been detained, kidnapped, harassed, and so on. At least 927 healthcare workers that have been killed. And again, I say at least because that is also a significant undercount. It's generally a bit easier to document and to verify death. But what we know again from Gaza is that as of this moment, approximately 1,600 Palestinian healthcare workers are believed to have been killed in Gaza since October of 2023. The same report here documents only 228 healthcare workers that were killed last year. By the end of 2024, that number was believed to sit somewhere in the region of 1,200. So a significant undercount. The vast majority of healthcare workers that are killed are nationals of the country in question. And there's been an awful lot of work done within the sort of humanitarian studies, critical humanitarian studies space that interrogates the racism that is built into this unequal burden of risk among healthcare workers. So, let's take a step back to 2016. 2016 was a significant year in the sort of the life course of engagement with attacks on healthcare. 2016 was the year that the UN Security Council voted unanimously to endorse Resolution 2286, which renewed a commitment to existing legal frameworks, renewed condemnation of breaches of international law and attacks on healthcare. This followed in the aftermath of the US military attack on MSF's Kunduz hospital in Afghanistan a year prior. And at that time, there was significant scrutiny of several perpetrators of attacks on healthcare, but most notably, of course, the US government and the Russian government in relation to their involvement in attacks in Syria. These two entities, of course, permanent members of the Security Council. So there was real pressure to push for a policy process. And forgive me, my health policy folks in the audience here, this sort of very simplistic kind of understanding of problem, policy, and politics, you know, that moment of alignment where they were able to push for this renewed commitment. What's happened in the years that have followed is not an awful lot. This is, as I've said, rhetoric that doesn't align with the reality on the ground. And again, we look to our Syrian colleagues, but many other academics and humanitarian practitioners who've called out effectively inaction despite these commitments. This is a quote from Joanne Liu speaking at the UN Security Council later in that same year. She was still president of MSF at that time, calling out inaction at the level of the UN Security Council. So what's the problem here? The documentation is there now. What's happened in the years since Resolution 2286 is a real investment, subpar as it may be, but a real investment in documentation, an attempt to understand better the scope of and the distribution of attacks on healthcare internationally. There are gaps in our understanding to some degree, the full impact of these attacks, the justification that different warring parties and belligerents use, but nevertheless, real investment in documentation. So our understanding of the problem is clear. What's missing now, of course, is the political action to uphold the legal frameworks that exist. What I would argue, and I think we were sort of alluding to this a short while ago, is that what we're seeing now in Gaza in particular, the actions that we're seeing play out, the derogations that we're seeing play out, these are trends and patterns that have long existed and have long been sort of percolating with minimal action, minimal condemnation, and now they are brought into extremely stark relief. So there's really nothing new. We're just seeing the amplification of pre-existing problems. And that's what I've tried to convey here with this graph. These are attacks on healthcare in Palestine, in the dark blue there, and attacks on healthcare in other contexts. And of course, we know that healthcare has long been targeted in Palestine, along with in several other countries as well. Len Rubinstein is a prominent academic in the field of attacks on healthcare. He's a lawyer by training. I mean, his quote speaks for itself. I also wanted to include a quote from a Syrian Sam's colleague in Aleppo. This was, I think, circa 2016. You know, the sort of disbelief and anger and frustration that it's quite clear what the problem is, but still we're not doing anything about it. One final thing I also want to mention is that attacks on healthcare is only one small part of a much wider problem here. If we think about the right to health and right to health frameworks, attacks on healthcare, on health infrastructure, on healthcare workers is a component of a much wider set of problems. So I don't want us to look, for example, at 2020 and think, oh, you know, it wasn't so bad for the Palestinians in 2020. The provision of healthcare, access to healthcare, systematic barriers to access to healthcare, the overarching structure of occupation has made life difficult for Palestinians in Gaza and throughout occupied Palestine for decades now. I mean, and it's very important that we don't, you know, hone in on attacks on healthcare as a sort of, you know, abstracted from these wider issues. So this is my final slide. I'm going to keep it short and sweet because I'd much rather we have an opportunity for discussion. But I wanted to sort of end on a kind of, you know, what are we looking for now? What are we trying to drive forward? Well, the most important thing to recognize is that there are certain preconditions to the delivery of effective and ethical healthcare in humanitarian contexts, but also anywhere in the world. If we think about the core competencies of a humanitarian health practitioner, one of the things, of course, is that we have an understanding of the ways in which our work is inherently and inextricably political and politicized. And we need to really just, you know, cut through some of this nonsense that still surrounds commitments to neutrality and so on and so forth. What's needed, of course, is to mobilize people to act, the political will to act. And of course, over the last 2 years or so, we've seen a complete absence, really, for the most part, of that political will. The legal frameworks that exist, and I take Neve's point that you know, the law is part of the problem as it's currently formulated, not simply the solution. So we really need to be rethinking, you know, does the law serve us? And many Palestinians have written very incisively on, you know, the international law has never protected the Palestinian people. There's a fantastic article in The Guardian that's the title is something to that effect, which I would recommend that you read. And then I'm also thinking, you know, what is our role as healthcare workers, allied health professionals, clinicians, public health experts, and so on? You know, this kind of focus on attacks on healthcare, wherever they manifest in the world, are a disgrace. And we must mobilize with consistency. We must call out acts of selective condemnation. Let me take, for example, the World Medical Association, which rightly condemned an attack that struck an Israeli healthcare facility the very day after it occurred some weeks ago, but took several months to say anything of substance about what was happening in Gaza. These are the institutions that represent us. There are several institutions in London that have gone after healthcare workers for showing solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian people. This is disgraceful. We really need to rethink again, what are the core competencies of healthcare workers? Again, a very interesting report that Tlaleng Mofokeng has just published. She's the UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Health. She's written and published in the last few weeks her annual report, which delves into the role of healthcare workers as human rights defenders. And I think we really need to appreciate that that is a core component of the work that we do. We can be fantastic physicians in the ER here, but if we are not speaking out in defense of our patients, of our colleagues, of the spaces in which we work, we're forever going to be very limited in the reach of our clinical competencies. Collective mobilization is definitely key in the period ahead. And this is a very, very dark period. I'm very deep in my nihilistic phase at the moment, folks. I apologize. But this is potentially, what we're witnessing now is potentially the end of humanitarianism, the end of international legal frameworks, the end of everything that many of us have believed to be true, that we've believed that exists to keep us all safe. There are obviously many people the world over that have always known that there's a degree of fallacy in all of these things. But we are in a state of rapid decline. And unless we mobilize to do something about it, unless we keep having these conversations and driving action through these conversations, we are in real trouble. I think I'll stop there.